Before we call this project finished, I think we should create a quick render setup to show this off in its best light. So let's do that as the last lesson. When I'm working with lights and cameras and all that stuff, I often like to have two 3D viewports, one for working in and one for rendering. That might be a leftover from the days of when rendering was a lot less interactive, but I still find it useful to always be looking through the camera's view and see what we're going to render. So what I'll do up here is in the top left of my 3D viewport, where my mouse becomes a crosshair, I'll left click and drag and split this over into two 3D viewports. The left will be for rendering and the right will be for working. So for the right one, I'll set this over to solid view, and then for the left, I'll middle mouse button and drag so I can see all of the buttons on the right, and I'll set this over to rendered view. I'll turn off overlays, and I'll also turn off gizmos. I can even right click on the header and go to header and uncheck show tool settings just to give me a little bit more room. And now I want this viewport to reflect exactly what we see when we're going to render. So under the render view options, I'll go down to scene world and check that back on. Now we can't render without a camera, so let's add one of those first. I'll also just shrink my node editor and my timeline here to give us a little bit more room. Then I'll hit Shift A, go down to camera, and add a camera in object mode. If yours is really small or really big, then go ahead and change that now. I'll scale mine down a little bit. And I'd like it to be looking through front view. So what I'll do is I'll hit 1 on my number pad to go right to front view. And then I'll go to view, align view, and align active camera to view, or use the hotkey Control-Alt number pad 0. That's a hotkey I use all the time. So I can look through my viewport, Control-Alt number pad 0, and then the camera will snap right to it. I'll go to front view again, Control-Alt number pad 0, and now my camera is looking from the front. To look through my camera on the left side instead, I'll hit 0 on my number pad while hovering my mouse over this rendered viewport, just like so, and then I'll zoom in a little bit. And then I'll navigate away from the camera in this view, and scale that down just a bit. Then let's set this device on a floor. So I'll select it, and thankfully we parented everything to it earlier, so if I just hit G to grab, everything else will follow along. I'll hit 3 to go to side view, hit R to rotate, 90 to rotate 90 degrees, and then negative so it's right side up. Then I'll hit G and Z and place it right on the floor. I'll zoom in pretty far here, and then just hit G and make sure that it's as close to the floor as I can get. Or since there is no floor yet, at least as close to the Y-axis. Then to create a ground, I'll hit Shift A, Mesh, and Plane. I'd really like to create one of those infinite backdrops because I think that makes for a nice effect. So I'll hit Tab to go into Edit mode for the plane, 2 to go to Edge Select mode, select this back edge, and then hit 3 to go to side view, E to extrude, and just pull this up. I'll pull it up at kind of an angle, and then I'll select that edge in the middle, Control B to bevel, and scroll up on the mouse wheel a couple times. That'll make a nice gradual transition, then I can hit Tab to go back to object mode, right click, and shade smooth. Now let's zoom in the camera a little bit. We can select it in object mode, and I'd like to use the move gizmos, so I'll go over to the viewport gizmos dropdown and turn on move. Then I'll move it in along the Y-axis until it's pretty close to the camera and filling up most of the frame. Maybe I need to move it up along the Z-axis as well. And then I'll rotate the device just a little bit. That way we can see the angles of it a little bit better. I'll rotate along the Z-axis, and it looks like that was about 30 degrees, but of course it doesn't have to be exact. If you want to adjust the camera from within camera view, so that you get some immediate feedback, what you can do is go into camera view, that's again 0 on the number pad, and then with the camera selected, you can just hit G. But often that moves it way too fast, so hold down Shift, and that'll move it in smaller increments. A really common hotkey I use here is to hit G, and then hit the middle mouse button, and that'll allow me to zoom in and out. So I can pretty quickly set up the camera this way, and now we can move on to some lighting. The first thing I'll do is add an environment texture, similar to the preview ones that we were looking at earlier, but these will be for the final render. I'll head over to the World tab in the Properties editor, and for the color, I'll choose Environment Texture. That's going to make everything a pinkish purple all of a sudden, and that just means that we have a missing texture, or a texture that's not loaded correctly. So we just need to click Open, and in the downloads for the course, I'll provide an HDRI that I got from HDRI Haven, which is a great resource. I'll use the Kaylee Interior one. Once we load that in, then we can see it in the background. For whatever weird reason, there isn't an easy way to rotate the HDR here, but we can do that in the node editor. So let's switch from object to world in the node editor so we can see our world nodes. And if we zoom out a little bit, then we can see that we have our environment texture plugged into the background. To be able to rotate this, we need to use a mapping node. So let's hit Shift A, Vector, and Mapping. Again, vectors are essentially the directions of 3D coordinates. So by plugging this vector into the vector of the environment texture, we're giving it directions. But we need to input a vector into the mapping node as well, otherwise it just comes in as blank. Unfortunately, it doesn't get plugged in the background. So I'll hit Shift A, Input, and choose Texture Coordinate. We can just use the generated option, plug that into the vector input of the mapping node, and then we're back to where we started. But now, I can choose the Z rotation and rotate this around. So I'll just continue rotating it until I find a setup that I like. I'll try 90 degrees, 120, 200, 270, and close to 360. One thing I don't quite like is how the highlight on the screen is kind of randomly placed and doesn't look that good. I also don't like how there's not a lot of gradation going along the surface of our object. So I'll just continue adjusting this until I find something that gets rid of that highlight and also has a nice gradation along the surface. I'd also like it to highlight the buttons if possible. It looks like a value of about 340 is working pretty well. So I'll go with that. But I don't want this to be our only light, because while it works for giving us some nice realistic lighting, it's not quite complete. So let's add some lights of our own as well. I'll hit Shift A, go down to Light, and I'll add an area light. Then I'll move this up along the Z-axis and scale it down quite a bit. The smaller we scale it, the sharper our shadows are going to be. So if we scale it too small, then we'll get some very sharp shadows. So I want to keep it at least somewhat soft. Now we're getting some nice highlights at the top of the device. But I often find that when I'm working with lights, it's really handy to be able to view them in isolation. That way we can see exactly what they're doing. So I'll set the strength of the world all the way to 0. Now we're looking at just the effects of this light. If I hide it, it should be completely black except for the screen. So let's maneuver this into place until we have something that exactly fits what we want for this particular light. I want it to give a nice highlight from the top, and maybe from the right just a little bit. That's going to highlight the buttons really nicely and some of these bevels. It's probably a little bit too bright though, so I'll go to the light properties and set this from 10 to 5. Just kind of cutting it in half. Then I'd also like to see a backlight on the left side as well, and this will be more of a rim light. So I'll hit Shift D and duplicate that over. And then I'll hide the original light. That way we're looking at just this one. I'll go to side view and tilt it a bit. Go to top view, and just move it around until we get a nice rim light. Let's see, I don't want to angle it too much because I don't like that harsh line that runs along in the background. There we go, I think that works really well. Now lastly, I'd like to have a light that cuts right through the screen and gives it a little bit of a glossy look. So I'll Shift D and duplicate this one again, and then also hide the second light. Now we're just looking at this one, and I want to place it somewhere where it's directly reflecting off the screen. So I'll go to top view and rotate this around, and maybe move it down until I can see it in the reflection. I'll rotate it towards the device, and just position it until it gives us the angle that we're looking for. I just want to cut through just the corner of the screen. This is probably still a little bit too bright, so I'll set this down to 1. And that's probably too dull, so let's try 2. Okay, now let's see what this looks like in combination with everything else. So I'll enable the other 2 lights, and then also go back to the World tab and set the strength back to 1. Now we've got a pretty good light setup. I think the one for the highlight is a bit too dull still, so I'll try setting that back to 5. It seemed a bit strong at first, but in combination with everything else, it was getting overpowered. Before we go and render this out, we should probably organize our scene just a little bit more. Because right now, since the console was the active collection, everything was added to it. So our camera and our lights are all part of the console collection, and that's not quite right. So let's select the scene collection to make that the active one, hit the new collection button, and I'll call this one rendering. That way, it can include our camera and all of our lights. Then I'll select the camera, shift select the top light and the outliner, and just drag and drop these into the rendering collection. Now I can turn these on and off if I need to. Then to finish this up, let's head over to our render properties. I think this is just a little bit washed out, so what I'll do is go down to our color management, and here we can adjust the exposure or the gamma. First though, I want to make it a little bit more contrasty, so I'll take the look and set it to high contrast. That'll make the colors pop just a little bit more, but it also shows how it is a bit overexposed. So I'll take the exposure and bring that down a bit. If you want to make it look more or less washed out, then you can change the gamma. Lastly, if you'd like to change the resolution of the image, then you can head to your output properties, which is the printer icon, and change that here. I'll set it to 1080 by 1080 just so it can be a square. We might have to adjust our camera after we do that though. So I'll hit 0 to go to camera view, make sure the camera is selected, and then just hit G, middle mouse button, and zoom in. If the perspective from the focal length is a bit extreme, then we can head to our camera properties and increase the focal length. I'll set it to 75, and then I'll have to zoom out a little bit again. And I think that looks a bit better. Also, and I forgot to do this earlier, I'd like to take the ground material and make it just a tad darker so it's not quite so blown out. So I'll select the ground here, which is just called plane, so I'll call that ground. I'll head to the materials tab, add a new material, and I'll call that ground as well, and take the base color and just bring it down to a more medium gray. And if you'd like, we could actually make this a little bit more of a colorful background. So maybe a nice desaturated cool color would look good in combination with the orange of the device. Once that's done, it's time to render it out. Let's head back to our render properties and go to sampling. And these are the settings that dictate how noisy it's going to be. Let's go to our render settings. The noise threshold is a pretty good default, but if it ends up taking too long for your computer, then go ahead and set this to something like 100 or 200. But for now, I'll leave everything at its defaults. I just wanted to make sure that denoise was checked on. I'll also switch the render device from CPU to GPU because my GPU can calculate it a lot faster. If you don't have that set up, then you'll have to go to Edit and Preferences, down to System, and choose your GPU here if you have one. Now I think we're ready to render. I'll set our render view here to solid view so it's not also rendering while we're rendering. That might slow things down a little bit. And then I'll go to Render and Render Image. You can also use the hotkey F12. Actually, I sat here and watched this for a little bit, but I decided to cancel the render because the maximum samples was just too high, and we don't really need to clear the noise quite this much. The denoiser is going to do a pretty good job because this scene is really simple. So let's increase the noise threshold a little bit, just so it won't take quite as long to render. I'll set it from 0.01 to 0.05. Then I'll hit F12 and render again. Of course, you don't need to render it multiple times, you can just call it good whenever you have an image that you like. Once it's finished, the denoising will kick in, and now we have a perfectly smooth result. We can go to Image and Save As, and I'd recommend saving it as a 16-bit RGB PNG. Then you can share your image with whoever you want. I'd really love to see your result, especially if you customized it with different colors or different buttons. So I'd highly recommend posting it to the CG Cookie forum, or you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at John Lampel. Thanks so much for watching through this course all the way to the end. Congrats on finishing it, and I hope this really showed you just how many cool things are possible in Blender. I know there were some topics in here that we were only able to touch on just briefly and kind of breezed by. So if you want a much closer look at how everything works in Blender and how you can make projects like these on your own so that you don't need tutorials, I'd really recommend going through the Fundamentals series next. That will get you started with everything you need to know to make your own projects. You can find those, of course, on cgcookie.com or on the Blender Market. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.